A thin line of light traced across the control interface as Varkan studied the shifting data streams. The fleet's approach trajectory, planetary atmospheric readings, electromagnetic fluctuations, his warship's command deck bathed in a soft crimson glow as analytical projections flickered across the laser plasma displays. Cold, calculated efficiency. The Xel'Thar Dominion had enacted planetary subjugation thousands of times before. A distorted pulse rippled through his heads-up display. One of his scout drones had relayed intercepted transmissions from the human military networks. Their communications flickered erratically, switching codes, modifying protocols, as though their entire defense grid lacked cohesion, disorganized, inconsistent, primitive. Varkan exhaled slowly, his secondary heart settling into a steady rhythm. He had survived countless campaigns, seen empires collapse before the Dominion's advance, but there was always that fleeting moment before conquest, the assurance of victory. This was no different. "Commander," an officer announced from the lower deck, his cadence clipped and precise. "The fleet awaits your final assessment. Shall we commence the invasion?" Varkan remained silent for a moment, glancing at the planetary surface beneath them. The planet's rotation cast half of the continents in darkness, while the other half simmered under the heat of its modest yellow star. A war fought on a single sphere, a localized conflict. The thought was almost amusing. "They are not yet aware of our presence?" Varkan inquired. His voice was smooth, weighted with the quiet patience of a strategist. "Our cloaking systems remain undetected. Their scanning technology—" The officer hesitated, adjusting his display. "It lacks consistency. They sweep erratically, as if unsure of what they are looking for." Varkan shifted his gaze back to the data scrolls. That was the third time inconsistencies had emerged in their defenses. The lack of pattern recognition was beginning to register as an anomaly. "Interesting," he muttered. He motioned a command through the air, and the projection expanded, revealing human military installations. They were widely dispersed, no centralized defense grid, no clear priority of protection. Cities lay exposed. Their orbital weapons platforms were few and inefficient. Nothing he hadn't seen before, yet something itched at the edges of his war-honed instincts. "Deploy reconnaissance teams. I want surface-level readings within the hour." The officer saluted and turned sharply, disappearing beyond the tactical pit. Varkan clasped his hands behind his back. Humanity's fragility was evident, yet something gnawed at his certainty. The first drone made landfall in what humans designated as North America. Its descent had gone unnoticed, and its cloaking field masked it from visual detection. As its mechanical lenses adjusted, it relayed infrared and spectral readings directly to Varkan's interface. The cities teemed with movement. Vehicular congestion, industrial emissions, inefficient resource distribution. Predictable. Yet, when the drone conducted a thermal sweep for military assets, it found no clear indicators of a centralized command center. Humans should have been rushing to reinforce their planetary defense grid. Their satellites should have been scrambling for signals. Instead, they were silent. Varkan's gaze hardened. "Where is their chain of command?" The officers exchanged glances. "It's difficult to pinpoint, Commander," one responded. "Their infrastructure is scattered. They are operating under compartmentalized leadership, each region handling its own defenses independently." A fragmented war effort? Unusual. Most civilizations consolidated under one primary military authority. The Xel'Thar relied on singular chains of command, ensuring efficient strategic execution. Yet humans had deliberately spread their leadership, ensuring no singular point of failure. Varkan's mandibles tightened. A coincidence, perhaps, but still inconvenient. The more he studied human history, the more the dissonance in his mind grew. Every species the Dominion had encountered followed predictable cycles. They expanded, they waged wars, they refined their technology, and then, when faced with superior military force, they surrendered. But humans, they had never stopped fighting. His display scrolled through records of conflicts spanning thousands of cycles. Wars fought over resources, territory, ideologies, survival. In every case, their civilizations had been forged in fire, rebuilt, and refined. A particular section caught his attention: the Second World War. He accessed the records. Cities reduced to cinders, weapons of devastating power, tactical ingenuity surpassing technological limitations. He leaned forward. Humanity had achieved total global warfare before even reaching the stars. Varkan rewound the footage. Soldiers digging trenches, ambush tactics in dense forests, naval feints designed to lure enemies into false security. This wasn't war. It was adaptation distilled into survival. The realization settled uneasily within him. Humans did not win battles. They endured them, analyzed them, and came back stronger. His thoughts were interrupted by an alert from the reconnaissance drone. Unusual digital interference detected. Varkan straightened. Display feed. The screen shimmered as the drone's interface glitched. Static. A deliberate countermeasure. Someone had found it. Impossible, one of the officers muttered. There was no sign of detection. The feed fractured into darkness. Then, a single transmission burst through. Whoever you are, we see you. Varkan's breath stilled. The Dominion fleet prepared for descent. They had intercepted human emergency broadcasts, military coordination signals, coded messages flickering between global defense networks. The humans were mobilizing, but too slowly. They recognize a threat, but they do not yet understand its scale, an officer remarked, his tone confident. Varkan wasn't so sure. He replayed the intercepted transmission. It had been deliberate. A message, not just to detect their presence, but to confirm it. They are moving too efficiently for a species that has never encountered us before, he muttered. No panicked global transmissions. No chaotic misfires. They were not scrambling. They were waiting. A cold unease settled into the pit of his chest. The fleet is in position, the officer announced. Shall we begin planetary occupation? Varkan hesitated. The doubt coiling inside him was unfamiliar, an emotion he had never associated with war. But the moment passed, and he lifted his chin. Commence deployment. As the Xel'Thar fleet began their descent, Varkan's gaze lingered on the display, watching as the first wave of landing craft entered the atmosphere. Yet before the fleet even breached the troposphere, new signals erupted across Earth's surface. Hundreds of electronic disruptions, tactical coordination spikes, cities darkening one by one, a planetary blackout. Not a sign of collapse, a deliberate act. Varkan's hands clenched at his sides. The last intercepted human transmission before the Dominion landed chilled him more than any battlefield had before. Let them come. We've been preparing for this war longer than they can imagine. And for the first time in his long military career, Varkan wondered, had the Dominion just walked into a carefully laid trap? Fleet Commander, our forward battalions are disappearing. Varkan barely turned from his display, his attention locked on the shifting tactical projections. The invasion had begun minutes ago, yet the data pouring in painted a battlefield that defied all logic. Entire units went silent without reports of engagement. No impact tremors from orbital bombardment. No firefights logged in the Dominion battle network. The Dominion had landed, but Earth was swallowing them whole. From his high-altitude reconnaissance craft, Varkan watched as the first warships broke through the atmosphere, sleek behemoths descending like gods of war. Their energy fields shimmered, stabilizing against planetary resistance as troop carriers detached, dropping toward designated landing zones. By all calculations, Earth should have been unable to resist. Their military infrastructure was scattered, their spacefaring capabilities rudimentary. They had no kinetic barriers, no atmospheric suppression grids, no orbital reinforcement fleets. It should have been over before it started. And yet, the Dominion forces were finding nothing but silence. Something is wrong. Varkan's words carried no urgency, yet his officers tensed. His eyes tracked the landings in real time. The invasion sites were abandoned. Command centers targeted for immediate destruction had been emptied hours ago. The civilians, millions of them, had moved before Dominion forces even arrived. Not in chaotic retreat, but with deliberate organization. A warning klaxon cut through the ship's command deck. Atmospheric anomalies detected. Varkan shifted his gaze as storm systems erupted along multiple latitudes, spiraling against expected climate behavior. Jet stream disruptions. The patterns weren't natural, they had been engineered. A calculated shift in wind currents sent pressure waves hammering into the Dominion fleet, destabilizing energy shields that had never been designed for meteorological warfare. A second alarm sounded. The laser plasma displays flickered. "Commander, our encryption networks are fracturing." The Dominion fleet's battle network faltered. Tactical coordination began breaking apart, data relays flickering in and out. Firewalls were failing, but not from brute force attacks. The humans hadn't attempted a siege against Dominion digital infrastructure. They had infiltrated it. The first troop carriers touched down in abandoned cities, their forces deploying with methodical precision. Scouting teams advanced, scanning for heat signatures. There was nothing. No immediate resistance, no sudden ambush. The streets stretched in eerie silence, the skeletal remains of a city that should have been alive with the chaos of occupation. Varkan inhaled sharply as the first energy readings spiked beneath the streets. Detonations ruptured the ground without warning. Dominion assault walkers, three-story behemoths engineered for urban control, vanished in cascading explosions. Entire buildings rigged with delayed charges collapsed onto unsuspecting troops. Not from random destruction, but from pre-selected structural weaknesses. A cold realization settled into him. The humans had mapped their cities not as homes, but as war zones in waiting. On the battlefield, Dominion squads pushed forward, their formation unshaken. Augmented warriors, veterans of 100 conquests, trained to fight under any condition. They advanced despite the collapsing infrastructure. And yet, as they crossed into the next sector, the shadows moved. Human forces didn't rush to meet them head-on. There was no desperate last stand, no centralized resistance to crush. Instead, they emerged in scattered groups, slipping between the wreckage, firing before vanishing again. Thermal cloaks. Varkan's breath hitched as the realization settled. They had negated Dominion biometric scanners. The shock troops barely had time to adjust before the next attack began. Not from firearms, not from explosive rounds, but from the enemy's own technology. Dominion war machines, captured, reprogrammed, turned against their creators. Energy projectiles lanced into the streets, tearing through exoskeletal armor that had never been designed to withstand its own weaponry. Soldiers fell without ever seeing their attackers. Their enemy had no face. On board the reconnaissance craft, Varkan's fingers twitched as he parsed the battlefield reports. Tactics were unraveling before his eyes. Dominion forces moved to regroup, attempting to establish secure perimeters. They never got the chance. Human forces exploited their rigid formations, attacking in staggered intervals, forcing Dominion troops into patterns before obliterating them with pre-positioned artillery. There was no centralized command issuing orders. The battle flowed like an organic system, adapting faster than Dominion algorithms could compute. A transmission flickered onto Varkan's heads-up display, scrambled, distorted, almost indiscernible. Then the interference stabilized, and a voice emerged. "You assumed we'd fight you directly. You assumed we'd break." His blood chilled. The Dominion had not hacked human systems. Humanity had hacked them. The next phase unfolded like a carefully conducted symphony of destruction. Dominion battalions pushed forward, forced into predictable choke points where railgun artillery fired hypervelocity slugs, bypassing energy shielding altogether. Troop carriers, now vulnerable without orbital support, were struck from beneath the surface, detonations blossoming from sewer systems, underground tunnels. Varkan's gaze locked on the display as a Dominion command station issued orders for a tactical retreat. The transmission never reached its destination. Human counterintelligence forces had hijacked their communications. The order had been replaced. Instead of a retreat, Dominion troops received an urgent directive to reinforce forward positions. A fatal mistake. Dominion squads rushed deeper into the cities, unknowingly sealing their fate. The deeper they advanced, the more the battlefield became their grave. From his vantage point above, Varkan could do nothing but watch as the first waves of the Dominion invasion force were erased. The reports grew more chaotic. battalion commanders demanding reinforcements that would never arrive, warship captains struggling to regain fleet-wide synchronization. Then the final piece of the trap snapped shut. The Earth's electromagnetic grid fluctuated in unison, surging with coordinated disruptions. Dominion ships still in high orbit experienced sudden propulsion failures, their navigation scrambling beyond recognition. Their battle network, once an unbreakable web of data, crumbled beneath an assault of cascading artificial intelligence overrides. Varkan inhaled sharply. They had never faced an enemy capable of this. The display flickered. Another transmission forced its way through. You aren't fighting a nation. You aren't fighting an army. You're fighting an entire species, and we've been studying war for longer than you've been ruling your empire. Something deep inside Varkan's core twisted. The battlefield had never belonged to the Dominion. It had always belonged to humanity. And for the first time since the invasion began, the thought surfaced unbidden in his mind. What if this war was never meant to be won? Pull them back! The command lashed through the laser plasma display like a crack of thunder. Varkan's taloned hand twitched as he scanned the unfolding chaos below. The fleet's tactical overlay pulsed with disarray, positions fracturing, units misdirected, fire support failing to synchronize. The humans had carved open a wound in the Dominion War doctrine, one they kept stretching wider with every engagement. They had no centralized defense, no predictable structure, only an ever-shifting response, reacting faster than Dominion strategies could compensate. "Commander, the ground battalions are requesting orbital support," an officer announced. The edges of his voice were fraying. "They're sustaining unsustainable casualties." Varkan's gaze flicked to the surface readouts. Cities reduced to rubble, Dominion war machines standing in ruins where once towering buildings had offered shelter. Yet the humans hadn't lost ground. They had abandoned it. Every bombardment was answered with new resistance, stronger than before. "Target population hubs." The directive slipped from his mouth, sharp and calculated. If they wanted to scatter, he would leave them nowhere to run. Orbital artillery platforms adjusted, positioning their sights on key metropolitan centers. The first blast ruptured a city block, sending a column of fire and dust skyward. A second strike erased an industrial district, leaving only a smoldering crater. It was war on a scale no human should have endured. And yet, they did not crumble. Varkan's mandibles tightened as enemy movements accelerated. Instead of breaking formation, they doubled down. Human forces adapted mid-battle, rolling with the destruction as if the devastation had been planned for. What should have been shock and disarray became nothing more than a transition into the next stage of resistance. "This is not a battle," Varkan murmured, eyes narrowing. "This is an ecosystem." The realization tightened around him like a closing vice. They weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting an evolutionary force. Below, Dominion troops pushing into newly bombed areas found themselves wading through what should have been uninhabitable wastelands. Yet the humans were already there, waiting. They had been maneuvered into urban traps built beneath their feet, intricate tunnels, hidden bunkers, sniper nests positioned in the skeletal remains of shattered towers. A direct assault was futile. The first Dominion units began malfunctioning. A scout patrol transmitted a distress signal, then vanished. Another squad responded to an emergency flare only to find an empty battlefield. Then came the whispers. The first transmission arrived in clipped, fragmented static. "We hear you. We are inside your network." Varkan stilled. The bridge crew turned, unease settling in. "Commander, that signal? It's on our encrypted military channel." The Dominion had not gained control over human communications. The humans had infiltrated theirs. The next transmission came, clear and deliberate. "Your soldiers are already dead." False reports flooded the command grid. Whole battalions received orders that never came from Varkan's officers. Units were redirected into kill zones, split apart by misleading coordinates, fired upon by their own artillery. "What is happening?" a lieutenant choked out. Varkan watched as Dominion forces turned against themselves. Commanders accused subordinates of treason, soldiers refused movement orders, entire companies abandoned their posts. too uncertain of which commands were real and which had been corrupted. It wasn't just a digital war, it was a war of belief. The Xel'Thar had never experienced deception as a primary weapon. To them, war was a test of force against force, superior numbers against lesser species. They had never fought an enemy that shattered trust from the inside. Below, a Dominion strike force attempted to regroup. Veterans of planetary conquests, their discipline unshaken, until the shadows moved. Captured Dominion exosuits, reprogrammed with human AI, walked among them. The first shots were fired by accident. A veteran soldier turned, thinking he recognized a superior officer approaching, only for his own weapon to be wrenched from his grip, turned against him. Panic followed. More of them appeared. Human special forces wearing Dominion armor, speaking in their language, issuing false orders. Varkan clenched his fists. They had weaponized the enemy's own image. Reports poured in, entire battalions vanishing into abandoned structures, only to never emerge. Dropships being hijacked mid-flight, their crews slaughtered before they even knew they had been boarded. Dominion soldiers running, breaking formation, choosing to flee rather than face an enemy they could no longer understand. Then the final act of war emerged. Captured Dominion weapons, reverse-engineered mid-battle, turned against their creators. Firearms calibrated to bypass Xel'Thar energy shielding. Exosuit power cores repurposed into explosive traps. The humans did not simply destroy their enemies. They dismantled them. Varkan had seen planetary sieges before. He had watched civilizations burn, had witnessed populations reduced to mere memory. But never had he seen an enemy grow stronger the longer they fought. "This cannot be possible," an officer whispered. Varkan's claws tightened against the control panel. The war was not shifting. The war had already been lost. Varkan accessed historical archives. The answer had to be buried somewhere. Footage flashed before him, centuries of war, each more ruthless than the last. Generals who sacrificed entire battalions to lure enemies into false victories. Soldiers who fought in ruined landscapes with nothing but scavenged weapons. Tacticians who turned their own defeats into springboards for deadlier campaigns. They had learned, from every battle, from every era, from every single war they had fought among themselves. This was not an enemy fighting for survival. This was an enemy fighting for mastery. The realization settled like a weight in his chest. The Dominion strategies had always been honed against weaker species, ones that fought conventionally, ones that followed the logical steps of war. Humanity followed no such rules. They adapted faster than battle simulations could predict. They turned their own dead into warnings. They lied, misled, countered, and struck with the patience of something far worse than a warrior race. A race that understood war as both an art and a science. A transmission cut through the chaos once more. "We are studying you." Varkan exhaled. For the first time in his life, he felt something entirely foreign. Not defiance, not anger, not resolve, fear. The Dominion had stepped onto the battlefield believing they were the apex predators. But Earth had been waiting, watching, learning. And now the hunters had become the hunted. "Commander, the High Sovereign demands an explanation." The transmission cut through the laser plasma display with sharp urgency, the Xel'Thar insignia flickering against the digital backdrop. Varkan's secondary hands clenched behind his back. They had waited too long. The Dominion's arrogance had given humanity time to perfect their counterattack, and now the final blow was coming. "The fleet is fully mobilized," an officer confirmed, his gaze flicking between incoming battlefield reports. "We are committing all remaining reserves to planetary engagement." Varkan exhaled slowly. A full-force planetary invasion. A desperate gambit from an empire that had never known defeat. His attention snapped back to the surface feeds. Dominion ground forces had surged forward, abandoning defensive formations, believing raw numbers would finally overwhelm the enemy. It should have worked. But the moment they entered the war zones, they were lost. Humanity had left no clear front line, no singular objective to seize. The battlefield had become a living entity, shifting under Dominion boots like a war-tuned mirage. A sudden energy fluctuation erupted across the stratosphere. The EMP strike detonated. A wave of electromagnetic interference rolled across the Dominion fleet, disrupting shield harmonics and rendering atmospheric stabilizers useless. Troop carriers plummeted from the sky, their pilots blind and helpless against gravitational forces. "Shields failing," a tactical officer choked out. "Commander, the humans, they knew we would escalate." Varkan watched the precise chain of destruction unfold across the war map. The humans had let the Dominion commit to a full invasion, luring them in before unleashing a synchronized disruption attack. Then, the real assault began. A gravitational distortion field rippled across high-orbit Dominion formations. Battleships, already compromised by the EMP surge, struggled to compensate as the fabric of the battlefield twisted. "What is that?" an officer's voice cracked. Varkan's secondary vision flickered as he analyzed the readings. The humans had engineered a localized gravitational anomaly, bending their own planet's forces against the Dominion fleet. A weaponized distortion field, designed to break formation mid-air. It worked. Dominion warships spun out of control, colliding with their own fleet. Smaller vessels, unable to compensate, crashed into the upper atmosphere and burned on re-entry. The human fleet waited. As the Dominion forces struggled, Earth's coordinated precision strikes began. Human warships launched salvo after salvo, targeting already compromised hulls, cutting through weakened energy defenses, with weapons designed specifically to exploit the gaps. "High Command is ordering a regroup." Varkan barely heard the officer's plea. His focus had zeroed in on something far more unsettling. Captured Dominion soldiers, reprogrammed, stripped of autonomy, had been turned into double agents. Their armor broadcasted false identification signals, causing automated Dominion security systems to register them as allies. The fleet's own sentries hesitated, and that moment of hesitation sealed their fate. The Dominion had been trained to trust their systems, to believe in the efficiency of their own technology. Now their reliance became a death sentence. Targeting software malfunctioned. Friend and foe became indistinguishable. Entire squadrons fired upon their own forces, unaware of the deception. Varkan's breath stalled. "This isn't war," he muttered, eyes dark with realization. "This is a dismantling." Dominion generals issued frantic commands, but nothing restored control. Chaos spread like wildfire. "We must retreat," an officer gasped. "High Command must—" The transmission cut out. Varkan turned. "Re-establish the connection." "No response, Commander." He checked the battlefield data, his vision narrowing. High Command was silent. Then, a new feed overlaid the tactical map. A Dominion Command dreadnought, one of the largest vessels in the fleet, detonated. Not from enemy fire, internal sabotage. The humans had done it. They had infiltrated the highest levels of Dominion war assets. "Commander," the lieutenant whispered, voice hollow, "they're tearing us apart from the inside." A new signal entered the command channel. It wasn't Dominion. It wasn't human. It was something far worse. "We studied you." Varkan's pulse slowed. "We understood your patterns, your weaknesses, your dependence on unchallenged authority." His hands curled into fists. "We didn't fight a war." The battlefield screens lit up with the destruction of the Dominion fleet. "We erased an empire." Varkan felt something twist in his core. The Dominion had never been outmatched technologically. They had been outthought. The last order came from the Dominion's remaining war council. "Varkan," the High Sovereign's voice rang through the transmission, the usual dominance replaced with something dangerously close to desperation. "We will not retreat. You will die before we surrender." Varkan stood motionless. They would rather be destroyed than admit the truth. He watched the last remnants of the fleet spiral downward, fire streaking across the sky as the empire that had ruled for millennia collapsed in real time. He closed his eyes. Then, he turned to his officers. "Transmit my command code to the human network," he said, voice quiet, final. The officers froze. "Commander?" "We are leaving," he declared. "Those who wish to die for arrogance may do so. I refuse." The weight of that choice settled over the bridge. He had never broken an order before, but then again, he had never fought an enemy like this. The transmission signal flashed green. His betrayal was sent. "Pull them out!" The order came sharp, final, cutting through the remnants of what had once been a grand Dominion fleet. On the laser plasma displays, Xel'Thar warships staggered away from Earth's orbit, their formations broken, their command structure in ruins. Some didn't escape in time. Human long-range batteries, their targeting systems flawless, picked off the stragglers, ensuring they would never return. Varkan stood motionless on the command deck of his dreadnought, his mind a battlefield of its own. This wasn't just a loss. It was extinction, narrowly avoided. The Dominion had never retreated before, not once, not in 1,000 cycles of conquest. And yet, here they were, fleeing. "Sir," an officer hesitated, eyes flicking between the evacuation patterns and the tactical displays. "Should we send a surrender negotiation?" Varkan's gaze didn't waver. "You assumed they would accept one." The Dominion did not understand mercy. Neither did humanity. Below, Earth's cities smoldered, the scars of battle fresh, but not one building had been abandoned to ruin. Reconstruction had already begun. Human war machines that had ripped through Dominion battalions now stood repurposed for rebuilding. The war was over. But they wasted no time mourning. Varkan's secondary hands flexed. They were already preparing. A quiet shudder passed through his vessel as the final Dominion warships vanished into slipspace. The retreat was complete. The battle had ended. But the war had only just begun. His voice, calm but edged with finality, cut through the silence. "Begin transmission." The officer hesitated. "To whom, Commander?" Varkan turned. To every remaining Dominion command station, to every listening outpost, to every system that still flies our banner. The message began recording. "This is Varkan, last surviving commander of the Dominion's Earth campaign. You will not believe what I am about to tell you. Do not mistake our survival for victory. Do not think of this as a setback. You have not lost a battle. You have waged war against something beyond comprehension, and it has seen you." The transmission flickered, displaying footage from the invasion, not just images of battle, but a detailed record of what had unfolded. Dominion soldiers turned against themselves, believing false commands. War machines hacked in real time, rewritten to slaughter their own kind. Cities that should have been ruins, transforming into fortresses overnight. Humanity had taken every strategy, every weapon, every failure of the Dominion, and absorbed it, learned from it, improved it. Varkan's voice was cold, devoid of the arrogance his kind had once held. They never planned to survive this war, they planned to master it. The footage shifted to show Earth's post-war mobilization. Military factories running at full capacity, engineers tearing apart captured Dominion technology, officers studying every engagement, preparing for the next inevitable conflict. We assumed we were fighting a primitive race, an isolated species clinging to their homeworld. We were wrong. The screen pulsed with an image, humans standing atop captured Dominion battle platforms, their banners rising where Xel'Thar insignias had once flown. They are not a nation. They are not a single empire. They are a storm that has been waiting to be unleashed. Varkan's mandibles tightened. He had watched civilizations fall before, seen enemies reduced to dust beneath Dominion war engines. But never had he seen a species that turned war itself into an art form. "Do not send reinforcements. Do not attempt retaliation. Leave them alone. Because if you return, you will not find soldiers waiting for you. You will find something worse." He exhaled slowly. "They will not seek vengeance. They will not demand surrender." The final image filled the transmission feed, not of destruction, not of death, but of humanity advancing, of a species that had no intention of stopping with Earth. Varkan stared at the growing fleet formations in orbit, the silent construction of new warships, each one bearing the scars of the battle that should have ended them. "They will come for us next." The recording ended. Varkan remained in the silence of the bridge, watching Earth shrink behind them. "Commander," an officer murmured, his tone brittle, "what happens now?" Varkan turned his head slightly, watching the war machine that had once been his empire retreat into the abyss. For centuries, the Dominion had ruled as conquerors, believing themselves invincible. But now, for the first time, they were something else. The hunted. His voice was barely above a whisper. Now we run. Humanity did not celebrate. They did not declare victory. They did not erect monuments or hold ceremonies. Instead, they prepared. In the aftermath, their focus shifted not to peace, but to adaptation. The remains of the Xel'Thar fleet were dismantled within days. Their technology reverse-engineered, their failures studied. Scientists analyzed every battlefield outcome. Commanders tested new tactics, revised planetary defense models, expanded countermeasures against future invasions. They did not wait for another war. They made sure they would be ready before it even began. Varkan sat alone in his private quarters, the dim glow of his heads-up display illuminating the darkness. He replayed the footage one last time. Not the battles, not the destruction, but the humans after the war. He watched as their military-industrial complex expanded, saw the quiet efficiency of their mobilization, weapons factories retooled, warships constructed with the scars of past conflicts still etched into their hulls, their designs now stronger, deadlier. His claws trembled against the console. "We thought we were the masters of war." The screen flickered, showing the first completed human dreadnought, far beyond what they should have been capable of building. "We were wrong." His voice dropped to a whisper. Humanity was merely waiting for a worthy opponent. The screen faded to black. Varkan closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he prayed they would never find another one.